Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us here today for Orr Group Talks with our special guest, first-time author, Salesforce exec, and social innovator, Brandolon Barnett. For those I haven't had the pleasure of meeting yet, I'm Tisha Hyter, and I serve as a vice president here at the Orr Group. We're a best-in-class consulting firm specializing in the business of philanthropy. If you'd like to learn more about our work, please check out our website or find us on LinkedIn. And you'll also find some great videos of our core values in celebration of our 30th year anniversary. So just a bit of logistics before we get started. We'll be recording today's talk, so feel free to watch again or share after we post it on our website. And if you have questions for Brandolon or myself even, please drop them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them. So in today's talk, we'll explore Brandolon's new book, right here, Dreams Deferred, Recession, Struggle, and the Quest for a Better World. In it, he shares his story of becoming an agent of change as a man of color, also while being in the world of philanthropy. So Brandolon's poignant story of being raised by a single mom, having a heart for service, and a wanderlust for international learning and adventure really offers a unique perspective on some of the challenging circumstances that he had to face just in trying to find a future against the backdrop of all of the complexities of this world. So not having access to the means to fund his education, travel, or even launch his career, he faced many obstacles that only fueled his drive to make the world a better place. I highly recommend the book, and I'm so glad Brandolon can join us here today. So thank you again, Brandolon, for joining.
It's such a pleasure. I'm excited for the conversation.
Thank you. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so who I am and discovering who I am and what I want to be has been, a struggle that I think a lot of the folks watching or listening might understand that I recount in the book. But the way I like to think of it now is that I wear a few hats. I'm an author, entrepreneur, and investor. I'm an angel investor in startups and businesses founded by people of color in DC and New York City, where I have connections and contacts, and I can get to the bottom of the passion of folks who need funding to fulfill their dreams and build businesses and then create wealth in communities. And so that's one hat. And on the other side, I am a director of CSR industry solutions or corporate social responsibility industry solutions within Salesforce, specifically salesforce.org, which is the impact center within Salesforce. And there I lead a team that is charged with really thinking about what corporate social responsibility teams and sustainability teams and companies need to be successful and how Salesforce technology can support them. The common sort of through thread for all of that work for me is I like to do things that make the world better than the way I found it. Because that's how I was raised, and that's become a passion for me.
So that leads into a question that I've been wanting to ask you as well. Tell me, what is your why? Why did you get into this work? What really kind of was the spark that lit the flame?
It's really funny, but I think the why for me is that I'm a nerd. So I grew up watching and loving science fiction. I love to read Arthur C. Clarke. 2001: A Space Odyssey is a book that blew open my entire perception of what it means to exist as an intelligent species. And I watched and loved Star Trek and Babylon 5. To this day, hearing Jean-Luc Picard kind of pontificate on the bridge of the USS Enterprise really is something that molded me and helped me to see that the world can be something more than it is today. So that's a big part of the why. But at the same time as I was having those experiences, I grew up in Dallas, Texas, and a part of Dallas called Oak Cliff, single mom, as you mentioned. And I just saw the disconnect between these amazing worlds that were inspiring me and the way the world around me actually worked. I would see my mother crying at night because she tried to hide it, but she couldn't, deal with a lot of the things financially, et cetera, that the challenges that would arise. And I saw people living in poverty. I saw violence. And I, when sort of putting those two pieces together, I thought, why are things this way, and why do we imagine these better worlds and not do anything about it? And how can I be part of actually making them become real? And I would say to this day, I was actually just watching a little Star Trek: The Next Generation last night. That's probably my inspiration, just not being confined or constrained by the world as it is, and always thinking about how it can be different, how it can be better.
Wow, that is absolutely inspiring just to hear that description. So, speaking of watching television, while the world was voraciously devouring content during the pandemic, you wrote your first book. So, tell us a little bit about how that came about. It was a really, really fun read.
Yeah, so I was inspired by, again, those two factors, these ideal worlds that I felt were possible and the world as it actually was, and trying to find a way to make it better. So at a young age, right out of college, even what inspired me to go to college, which was not a given in my family, I was among the first, I began to be obsessed with that idea in a lot of ways, and some of them unhealthy, to be honest. But the end result was that I desperately wanted careers in charity, nonprofits, and philanthropy, and specifically international NGO work, which to me represented the ability to help people reach their full potential no matter where they were in the world by providing resources that they might need to develop. And so I graduated, pursued that career, and it was just incredibly difficult. And especially because I had graduated in 2007 as an undergraduate, right into the Great Recession. And so right off the bat, I was dealing with trying to find work that actually paid enough to allow me to pay my student loans, to help my mother to be able to stay in her home, to have food to eat, and a place to sleep. And so those kinds of ordinary challenges were just so ever present and huge in my life, but I wouldn't give up. And I just stayed on this track and with this idea that I could be part of work of some kind that made the world better. And I had a very specific idea of what that work could be. But my ideas evolved as I grew in my understanding of what impact really means and all of the different kinds of careers and roles that can have an impact. But that growth and understanding took a lot of pain. I start the book at rock bottom, which we can talk about further, but wandering the streets of San Francisco looking for a spot to sleep for the night because I had taken an unpaid returnship there, trying to break into this field of corporate social responsibility. And so I wrote the book thinking for two reasons. First, I wanted to inspire because the past 18 months or so that we've been through have been really hard.
Yeah.
And so as I was looking around at the world, and as things were getting worse, especially at the beginning of 2020, I'd thought about writing the book for a long time, but it really occurred to me that now's the time, because so much of what I experienced, the loss of someone you love, I mean, over 600,000 Americans who died, those are mothers, those are children, those are fathers. And so the fact that I've kind of somewhat experienced that loss, you can never really understand someone else's pain. But if I could share my story, perhaps it could help someone to see their way through that loss, but also that economic hardship and how you can go through that and still hold on to a dream that you have. And so I wrote it for that reason. And I've been very heartened for the feedback from folks who were telling me in a variety of different contexts and settings that it's been helpful for them to know that someone who made it out went through the same things. And especially in a world of social media, it can be hard to sometimes feel that. So that was the first reason. I just wanted to inspire others to stay strong in the face of all that we've been through. The second was that as I've gone along in my journey, I've had this desire to be part of work that made the world better. And yet it's very hard to break into careers in philanthropy and nonprofits and charity for a variety of different reasons that we could go into. But I also wanted to just challenge the narrative about what philanthropy is, what impact is, and who gets to have it, who gets to be a philanthropist. Because it's not just the wealthy among us, it's folks like myself who want to be involved but don't have a lot of money. And the more I learned about that space, about the history of giving back and altruism, there are things like Black churches, giving circles, mutual aid groups that have existed for generations. and have attempted to make an impact on the world and have many times changed lives, but they don't get the same credit. And so I want to start a conversation and be part of a conversation that expands the definition of social impact. And I think a lot of that is happening organically. You think about Black Lives Matter last year, a lot of companies that I work with changed their framing. No longer were they just making grants to nonprofits. They were also suddenly thinking about how can we support minority-owned businesses? How can we support and identify minority-owned businesses in our supply chain? When you logged into Uber last year, you were being asked to, find a minority-owned business that you could buy food from on Uber Eats. And
Right.
so that change and that shift in framing is happening organically. The Gates Foundation, even, which is the sort of scion of traditional philanthropy now, is driving some of that change. So it's happening, but I feel like it's happening in a way that's sometimes disconnected from people. And I wanted to be a part of it and actually show the journey of someone who found a place in philanthropy, nonprofits, and charity that's a little bit different, and yet still, is an example of the ways that there can be space and a voice at the table for everyone.
Oh, absolutely. That's a fantastic, fantastic examples. And in that you were saying that you start the book by starting at rock bottom, wandering the streets of San Francisco. The concept of these returnships and the ways in which the nonprofit world oftentimes has an imbalance. Why was it important for you to start there?
Well, one, keeping in mind I had two objectives. It was important for me to start at rock bottom because I wanted to start out by being authentic. Because you can't inspire people with a lie. You can achieve other objectives, but true inspiration, I think, comes from authenticity. So if someone read one chapter, I wanted it to be that chapter, to know that someone has been through what they've gone through. So that was the first reason. But the second was that, yes, we really need to think about the structures that allow people or that restrict people from gaining access to careers in our space. And one of those is most certainly the fact that a lot of, especially big philanthropy, big charity, big multilateral institutions that do incredible work tend to be kind of grouped in these very large, very expensive cities like Washington, DC, New York, San Francisco. And the networks that you need to understand career opportunities and options in those areas, to be able to get in front of the right people, to be able to talk to them, to understand how your skills might translate to roles in that space. Well, those networks also exist in those places. And what does that mean for people who don't have means? When we expect, and what's interesting is I remember I went to graduate school, University of London, and I recount in the book some of the financial hardships that came from that as well. But it's what I had to do. And I remember trying to get an internship with the United Nations. I was in an international studies and economics program, a reputable program. And it's kind of the world's greatest example of what we're talking about, where there's an expectation that you would move to New York or Geneva as an intern with the United Nations and be paid nothing or very little. Who can actually do that? A very small percentage of people in the US, which is the richest country in the world, let alone globally, can take advantage of those opportunities. And it's just something we need to change. And so if someone, again, read one chapter and took that away as a lesson, I felt that could make an impact as well.
Yeah, and it was a beautiful testament of faith, not only in yourself, but in the world being better than it was presenting itself in that moment. People sometimes ask me, how did you get into philanthropy? And I think, I guess it was when I was about 7 years old. I would go and have breakfast at the church across the street from my elementary school, because that's what all the kids in the neighborhood did. And, one day, one of the adult volunteers gave me a coat. It was a peach coat with a furry collar. And you can see just in my spirit is like taking me back there. It made me feel so incredible. And that is how I got into philanthropy. My heart has always
Mhm.
been in philanthropy. And until I found a job in philanthropy, I couldn't feel that joy again. Do you think people have to have like a struggle story or some kind of proximity to the work that we do in the nonprofit world in order to have an authentic connection?
That is such an amazing question. And I think my answer is a little bit nuanced because on
Mm.
the one hand, I on the one hand, I'm tempted to I'm inclined to say yes, because, and I'll use the example from my own experience. So as I mentioned, I am a product strategy guy at salesforce.org. So I have helped to design our philanthropy cloud products. I also last year, in response to COVID, helped to design our response as a company to COVID-19,
Oh,
work.com. And
fantastic.
specifically, I led our build out and design and conception of a well-being platform for employees, with the recognition that well-being is going to be more important in impacting people positively in the workplace than ever before. And when I'm engaged in the process of building out a product, it certainly helps to understand the customer. It helps to understand the market at a deep level, the problems that they're facing. And
Mm.
so I do think that that voice is incredibly important. But at the same time, as a product manager, I have built, and an entrepreneur, I've built products without necessarily being the person who's affected by those problems. And so I think also that there is space at the table for people who haven't necessarily directly experienced the problems that they're helping to solve with, for, or on behalf of their stakeholders, or the stakeholders of their organization. But here's
Mm.
where I think, here's the point that I think is important, whether you have that experience or not. The question is, does that voice have a seat at the table? And too often, when you think about philanthropy and charity, there's a lot of voices that, just statistically speaking, do
Yeah,
not have a seat at the table when we're looking at the
right.
boards of organizations, when we're looking at who's receiving grants, when we're looking at the ranks of program officers and nonprofit leadership. And now technology is getting into the game of changing the world. We do that at
Mhm.
salesforce.org and at other companies. And the same issues need to be relevant there. Do you have a seat at the table for the voices affected by the problems that you're trying to solve? So I
Mhm.
don't necessarily think the person needs to have that, but needs to make it a priority to give that voice a seat at the table. And I don't think that's happened too often in our space.
Ah, I love that. That reminds me of there is let me see if I can find it, wonderful quote, one of the many quotes that I loved in the book. It says, what did it even mean to engage in social good if only a few voices defined and got to engage in that work? Whose world would we end up building and reinforcing? Really, really poignant. So let's dive into that. Tell me where your mind was when you were asking those two questions.
Well, at that time, I had actually finally escaped, I think, abject poverty so I could eat.
Mm.
There were times in my life where I felt guilt, going, oh, I shouldn't have gone to McDonald's. It's too expensive. I don't have the money. I shouldn't have got those chicken
Oh,
nuggets. And so I finally escaped that kind of circle of frustration and pain. Um, and I was working at the Council on Foundations, where I was the research manager. So if you're familiar with the Council on Foundations, it's based in Washington, D.C. It's an organization that is the national sort of representative body for philanthropy. And at the time, the numbers may have changed, but there were thousands of members, ranging from community foundations all over the country to large private foundations like the Gates Foundation, Sloan, et
mhm.
cetera, as well as operating foundations and public foundations. And they have a variety of different research projects that I was overseeing. So I was, at the time, the G5 initiative was active. So I was doing research at the council on diversity and philanthropy using one of our main research products, which was a study that has been going on for decades. It's a survey sent out every year to big foundations, program officers, that looks at the breakdown, composition, salaries, everything related to the ranks of program officers and staff. And at the same time, I was having conversations with a lot of these different organizations and institutions. And I was struck at the time, it was a big conversation. You couldn't go to, so I'm not saying anything that anyone hasn't heard. You couldn't go at the time, and perhaps it's still even the case, to the Council on Foundations annual convening, thousands of people, and not see dozens of sessions about DEI and philanthropy. Same for EPIP was trying to make a big push and change, and a lot of the affinity groups, and the same for a variety of different associations. And so at that time, I was seeing just a stark lack of voices in the room. These were organizations and institutions with all the best intentions. I would never impugn the intentions of anyone in this space, because I think it's very clear that for anyone, there are sacrifices that you make to work in this space. There are things that you put up with and come to work every day and try to make a difference. But I was just very struck by who was and wasn't in the room. And at one point, the thing that really crystallized for me was I grew up in Dallas, and I was working with a local foundation. I was on the board, and my mother was a single mom. She loved to cook, she loved fresh veggies, but she didn't have time. And I think that's true for a lot of single mothers. And so I left the meeting. I was one of two people of color kind of in this advisory group. We walk away and miss a meeting and come back a couple of weeks later. And the organization and all the board is very excited about providing fresh vegetables to people in the community where I grew up. And myself and the other person of color who was Hispanic are looking at each other and saying, well, this sounds great, but there are a lot of single moms in this neighborhood. Like, these fresh veggies are going to rot. Like, they don't have time to cook every day.
Oh, wow.
And
Yeah.
if you can, have we looked at the data into frozen vegetables? Like, what is the nutritional content? Like, that's something that can actually last longer. And so all these things are kind of bubbling around in my brain. And I just started to think, like, whose world are we creating? And it's been one of the themes for me as I've gone on this radio tour and talked about the book, which is just going back to that idea of, if you want to build something good, you need the voices and you want to build something that affects change, you need the voices at the table of the people who have the problems and who are going to experience that change. And
Right.
it just became really clear to me at that time that, especially at the highest echelons of our space, that's never happened. I could go into other examples. So for example, I led the largest study at the time of impact investing within foundations, and went to the Council on Foundations conference. After I left there, I was running the Grow Fund, donor advised fund startup, and doing CSR consulting with Global Impact, an NGO based in DC. And so I go to the conference, I'm speaking, it's actually in Dallas. Later, I'm at the hotel, I'm having a nightcap before heading to bed. And I met a gentleman who'd started a small business in Dallas. He was buying homes and building them out, refurbishing them, and then selling them to people in the community. But he had decided that he was only going to hire people with a criminal record, a criminal background, because he saw that they couldn't get opportunities. And he saw what that did to his family, his mother and his father, and he wanted to be part of the change. And I'm sitting there talking to him at the bar. His passion was so incredible. He's achieving some success. He's doing good for others in his community. He wasn't in the room talking or thinking about impact investing or the kinds of business opportunities that he didn't even know the term and what it meant when I spoke to him.
Right.
That's a problem. To my mind, that's a problem. And so everything I do now is increasingly about, how do we change that? How do we bring more people into the fold and democratize the work that we're doing as a space?
Absolutely, because representation matters, and having diverse voices in the room allows us to create a harmony we wouldn't experience if we just had one note, right?
Yeah, and representation matters when you're building anything. A lot of the interviews I've had, I've been asked, why does this conversation even matter? And I just go back to the idea of, no one builds a good product without the voices in the room being representative of the people who are going to be affected by it. And the truth is, this very simple and obvious truth is that we all live in this world. So if you want to change it, representation matters.
Absolutely, absolutely. But one of the things that we've talked about with your story in particular, was just how much debt played a factor. I mean, just the fact that, you went into debt going into school, but debt even played a role in helping prevent you from getting your dream job at the time.
Yeah.
Tell the audience a little bit about that, and what key lessons did you take away from that?
Yeah. So again, inspired by this vision, these kind of haunted by the ghost of Jean-Luc Picard in my mind, I, wanted to again do work that changed the world. And one of the most kind of clear ways I thought to do that was to join the Foreign Service. And I wanted to be a Foreign Service officer doing public affairs, working to make better connections between international communities, support programs, all the things that the State Department does. And so I took and passed all the Foreign Service exams, waited over a year, and was denied what was called a suitability clearance at the time because I was told I had too much student loan debt. And that was crushing.
Yeah.
And when we think about the world that we live in, that is going to be more and more of a problem that we must overcome. Because again, when you want and need those voices at the table, what are the obstacles that are in the way of people being there? And unfortunately, that kind of debt is a massive obstacle for a lot of people. And as a result, we're losing, I'm not even counting myself. There are people out there way smarter, way more driven, way more talented than me who don't have a seat at the table because they don't have the money to, pass some tests that we're putting in the way of that kind of work. And I was reading a piece today about this, I think it was in the New York Times, and it was saying 75% of jobs now are asking for a college degree. The proportion of people who actually have that in the United States is much, much lower than that 75% threshold.
Right.
And so, one of the things I've been saying as I talk to leaders, especially in the nonprofit space, is do you really need that? Or is there an opportunity? Are there resources to give people a chance, to take a chance on people and help them to grow outside of that one framing, which happens to be incredibly expensive and incredibly inaccessible? And I think it's a problem for our space. And I think it's a problem that we need to grapple with in charity and philanthropy. And this intersects with a lot of the work that I do now, but the idea of impact, as I mentioned earlier, is shifting. And so if you think about impact as the sole domain of philanthropy and nonprofits, then that's not a problem. If you want to have impact, that's the place you kind of have to go. And there are some market dynamics which occur, which is effectively give those sectors a kind of monopoly on impact. But when we think about companies expanding their CSR strategies, when we think about the development of B corporations in the early 2000s, which has just exploded, sustainable companies and sustainable products, you can go different places now to have a career that has an impact. And for philanthropy and charity, you have to think now about competing for talent with those new destinations. And a lot of those places, there's a lot of greenwashing that happens. You don't want to drink the Kool-Aid. There's a lot of development that needs to happen to make sure the impact that's happening in those new domains is real, but there's no stopping that train. And so for philanthropy and charity, they really, really need to think if they want to attract the next generation of talent to help solve these really pressing problems, which I think that nonprofits and philanthropy and charity have a unique perspective and a unique view on the challenges of the world that's incredibly valuable and should not go away. You need to overcome some of these barriers to access to careers in that space, and things like helping people to have if you're a funder and you're talking about the overhead myth, or a donor and you're thinking about the overhead myth, and also a concern with kind of systemic inequalities, well, ask yourself, how can I make a donation and support this organization that's trying to promote poverty in my community? Meanwhile, the folks working in that nonprofit are making poverty wages. That's overhead, but to address systemic inequality, we have to tackle both issues. And so it just requires a really honest conversation that I think a lot of folks are hoping to have, and I just want to be a part of it.
I love that. I love that. Do you think that we're starting to have the conversation now that we have mega gifts that we haven't seen before, where they are coming without the same kind of restrictions and limitations even on the grants that have been given?
I think that's a big shift. And one of the big trends seen in the corporate social responsibility or corporate philanthropy space in the past 18 months or so has been the lifting of some of those restrictions on grants. And I think that's an important shift.
Mhm.
But it's just a beginning because, well, I'll stop there and say that it's just a beginning.
Mhm. Yeah, and speaking of just a beginning, I talk with a lot of my colleagues about how different the tone was of the world of nonprofits and philanthropy last year, when a lot of people were acting in response, using their philanthropy as a form of activism during the Black
Mhm.
Lives Matter marches and in response to the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Um, but it's kind of quiet now. What are your thoughts about that?
It's quiet and it's quieted down in some senses, which was expected. But on the other hand, I think it shifted the narrative. So last year, I was fortunate to be pulled onto a small team. There were about 10 of us in Salesforce who got invited to a kind of top secret mission. And a few weeks into the mission, we're kind of talking about this theoretical product and end up being connected with Sean Combs, P. Diddy or Puff Daddy, and
Uh-huh.
the Combs Enterprises team, and spent the next 9 or 10 months helping to develop a product that was actually announced and launched at the anniversary in Tulsa, at the anniversary of the Tulsa massacre, I believe, a couple of months ago. And that product is going to be a kind of digital main street for Black entrepreneurs. So the conversation has quieted somewhat, but there have been some systemic changes in perception, building out of platforms, changing kind of grant strictures and frameworks that I think will have some lasting impact in in ways that I think we need to be really cognizant about and conscious of, and everyone needs to be engaged with. But that change is still happening. And I think a lot of it is being driven by corporations and by entrepreneurs and by innovators. Um, Another example is the massive increase in the number of Black angel investors and VC funds that are
Mm.
looking to find not just Black, but entrepreneurs of color and even entrepreneurs in rural areas who are also left out of a lot of these conversations. And those changes, I think, are here to stay because they present massive opportunities for new innovation, for new people to be heard. And so I believe they're here to stay. But I'm I'm going to try to make sure that they're here to stay.
I
So
love it.
I'm going to do everything in my power, and I know that others like Edgar Villanueva are out there doing everything in their power as well to make sure those conversations are here to stay.
I love it. I love it. I love the passion that you bring to this work. You know, Tell me, what else are you working on? I know that you have the work that you're doing at Salesforce, but also democratize ventures. Tell us a little bit about that too.
Yes, so with the launch of the book, I've been angel investing for a few years because my mother always wanted to start a business, and I saw what happened to her with not having, when she passed away, health insurance, not having money. And so one of the ways that I think that I want to have an impact is helping people to achieve those dreams and find some financial stability, because without it, I mean, it's hard to interface with the world when you're hungry. And I've experienced that firsthand. So with the launch of the book, I formalized my angel investing into an entity I've called Democratized Ventures. And I want to support two things. One, entrepreneurs of color, because that's where I think I have some understanding of the challenges they might be facing as entrepreneurs. And I want to offer whatever advice I can or funding to help them build their businesses and achieve their dreams. So that's the first qualifier for my investment thesis. And the second is that I believe that true change and innovation of the past 20 years has been driven by democratization and access to new products, to products and services that were previously not accessible to certain populations. And so when you think about some of the most memorable innovations of the past 20 years, like Netflix, well, or Uber. In the case of Uber, they democratized access to a private car. That used to be something that only the wealthy can do. And now we take it for granted, but you can order a private car. If you were to go back 40 years or even 25 years, that's
Even
kind of an
10
insane
years.
proposition.
Yeah.
Even 10 years.
Yeah.
And the same for services like Netflix and Spotify. There were always people who had massive collections of films or massive collections of music, but that was incredibly expensive to purchase, to store, to maintain. And now we all have access with a small subscription relatively to every movie ever made, every song ever produced. And so what are the next frontiers of that kind of innovation? How can it be done in a way that's sustainable? So I like to help entrepreneurs that I support through Democratized Ventures think about issues related to sustainability and the idea that even if you're a startup with one employee, you can think about having a corporate advice fund and sending a percentage of profits to causes in your community. You can think about diversity, equity, inclusion in your hiring and supply chain strategies. All of these things I work with big companies on within my role in Salesforce or my past as a CSR consultant, you can do as a small business. And what ideas that can be brought to bear on those challenges can come from the minds of people who often get overlooked, people of color. And so Democratized Ventures has become a real passion for me. So that's what I'm doing now. And I'll be announcing my first investments later this year. On top of that, if I think about what I'm doing, I have a lot of passion for the work I'm engaged in with now at Salesforce, where we're kind of grappling with the change at salesforce.org that's happening in the social impact space. And we launched our philanthropy cloud a couple of years ago. A few years ago, I joined and helped design the product before it went to market. And it's been incredible to see it get some success. But what's next? Companies want to do a lot more than employee giving and engagement. They really want solutions for all of the work that they have to do, whether that's their grant making, their employee giving and engagement, their sustainability, their well-being, the well-being of their employees and other stakeholders. And they want all of that data to be more readily available and easily intermingled and integrated so that they can make better decisions that drive greater impact. So that's been a big focus for me kind of in my everyday role. But I view both, again, through the lens of that common thread, which is how can I leave the world better than I found it?
That's really powerful. I think when we focus on just the work that you're doing with Democratized Ventures, one of the things that we talk about often here at Orr Group are companies and organizations focused on ESG. How much is that playing into your viewpoint as well?
I'm not quite sure I'm not quite sure I follow.
So
could you repeat the question?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that we focus on, major point of focus here is companies and organizations that are focused on ESG, ESG solutions and an ESG viewpoint and the way in which they look at investments, engagement, and opportunities to connect. Is that something that drives you as well?
It is. But I think I'm also scared of the term ESG, to be a little frank. So I have a fear. I think it is good that companies are acting with intention and with respect to the impact that they can have on their stakeholders, whether that's the environment, their employees, their customers, their supply chain. I think that is incredibly important. When we think about ESG, though, for any of the listeners not familiar, ESG stands for environmental social governance, and it's a framework that's growing rapidly in popularity that seeks at its heart to measure through a kind of proliferating set of frameworks that include the Sustainable Development Goals, SASB, and some others, kind of what the outputs or what the impact is within corporations. And in a lot of ways, it's an incredible movement because there are some companies who are now saying, we are going to tie executive compensation to our ESG performance. That's an incredible change. What I am a little bit wary of is the danger that ESG could become for the social impact space what GDP has become for economics, which is to say that it's a set of measures and metrics that don't really reflect the impact that's happening in the world. And what I want to avoid is a companies getting on a stage and saying, oh, we, according to this framework, our impact is, tops in the world. Just like a country could say our GDP is great, but when you actually look at the lives and the lifestyles of people within those economies, the countries with the same GDP could have vastly different qualities of life for the people who reside in those economies. And so I very much believe that that's an important movement that we need to all be engaged with and understand, especially if you're a nonprofit or even a foundation. The role that companies and that ESG are just going to play in, if you're a foundation, in your endowment and how you think about your endowment and where you're invested is going to grow tremendously. Right. I heard a statistic recently that about half the wealth under management today is kind of earmarked for things related to sustainability and to environmental sustainability specifically. And there's massive amounts of funding there that's going to affect endowments for years to come, how they're structured, how they're put together. Beyond that, if you're a nonprofit though, ESG means that the nature of your relationship to companies can change dramatically because no longer are you just going to a company and saying, we want a sponsorship, we want a grant. You also now have the opportunity to look at their ESG portfolio, how they're representing the work that they're doing that has an impact in the world, and partner with them to help be better. And I think that's a tremendous opportunity for nonprofits to bring their expertise, their understanding of the problems that their constituents and stakeholders face on the ground that are related or material, as they say, to what companies want to achieve, and help them think of their programs, think of their strategies, and hopefully be compensated for that partnership in some way, even whether it's a grant or some other means. Fee for service, for example. So I think there are tremendous opportunities for ESG to transform how the nature of relationships in the social impact space. I don't want to, though, just get hung up on the numbers that come out. And so or the phrase. And so I'm very wary of that dynamic developing in our space.
That's a great perspective. I really appreciate that. We have a couple more questions, but I want to make sure that I remind folks to feel free to put any questions or comments in the chat. We'd love to answer those as well. But Brandolon, I love how you close out the book, with this mindset that you've been sharing this hour we've spent together. It's really about solutions oriented. So you close out the book kind of creating this framework. We as nonprofit professionals and even in business are always focused on the goals of the enterprise. But not very often do we focus on our own individual goals. And so it was important for you to provide a map at the beginning of that, of your book. How did you come up with the infrastructure here?
So for me, as I was going through some of my darkest times, which I recount in the book, I felt lost. And one day it occurred to me that, if you're lost, what do you need? You need a map. So I began to, and what is a map? I kind of began to put that framing onto how I approach my career and the world and the work that I want to engage with. And for me, a map consists of locations. It's places I want to go. It's the events I want to be at. It's people I want to meet. And so I began to just learn across those dimensions about people, about places, about organizations doing work that had an impact. And I removed my own biases. So until that point in my career, I had seen a very limited set of kind of careers that could help me fulfill that dream of making the world a better place. And that wasn't working for me. I was, that's the point where I was at rock bottom. I had nothing. And so I made this map and I began to just put all my effort and energy into exploring it. What conferences do I need to be at? What webinars do I need to be at? What people do I admire who are doing work? Forget about whether they work in the nonprofit sector or philanthropy. Are they trying to make an impact? Are they doing something that I can believe in? What do they read? Where do they go? What institutions do they work with or partner with or support? And I just made lists, literal lists and maps of these things and just try to get closer to them and navigate my way through them and understand how they related to and worked with each other. And at the same time, I was beginning to delve into this world of corporate social responsibility, and the terms used in CSR or corporate impact have changed so much over the last, even in the past 10 years that I've been deeply involved in the space. At the time, there was this idea of the triple bottom line, this idea that everything a company did, within the frame of corporate social responsibility had to benefit people, planet, and profit. And I was inspired by that idea of how you think creatively and innovatively about finding a balance between different material concerns. And so I came up with one for myself as I was navigating this map. And for me, it was the 3 C's. It was company or the organization I support, community, and career. And so those 2 things drove me to be innovative about how I can be involved. And I wanted to share that thinking. And because if someone's out there replicating the thought process, again, maybe they can be inspired and build on what I've done and be better. Because there are so many people. One of the stories that I think of so often is I mentor in DC. That's how I like to volunteer and give back. So I was a mentor at Thurgood Marshall Academy in Southeast DC in Anacostia. And it's an amazing school, and they do this mentorship program where they bring in professionals, pair them with a sophomore, and you kind of maintain connections with that student who's volunteered, a lot of times forcibly by their parents. And you just kind of partner with them through high school. So you help them answer questions, you go to the movies with them, you build a connection for them and help them see possibilities for themselves. And so one day we were going to see, this was years ago, we're going to see the Martin Luther King film that came out. And I'm sitting on the bus with my mentee and a couple of his friends, and they're asking me what I do. And I'm saying, oh, I work in corporate social responsibility and philanthropy. And they just looked at me. They had no idea what I did. And I'm sitting there thinking, well, I know that this mentorship program, as well as your school, is funded by a lot of big foundations, receives funding from a lot of foundations in the DC area and the DMV, DC, Maryland, Virginia area. Also, I know that this program is sponsored by some companies. Why don't the beneficiaries know the dynamics that are supporting them? Yeah. That to me is the first step in us changing this space, because I can sit all day and say, I created a map of this space, but I already knew about it at that point. I had a master's degree. I had done, suffered through sometimes, and sometimes felt amazing sense of achievement by doing incredible work in the US, on the ground in multiple countries, working with NGOs. I had been very fortunate, even through all my struggles, to know enough about the space to know that it existed and that I could build this map. What I think we need to think a lot about now is why do so many people not know that the space that we work in and believe so much in and have so much passion for, no matter who you are, that's probably the case. Why do so many of the beneficiaries not know what we're doing?
Yeah.
That to me is a challenge that I think can be overcome fairly simply by just getting into new rooms in front of new audiences. Yeah. And so I'm not sure I entirely answered your question, but it's just a little bit of my perspective.
That was great. Yeah. That was really good. And it leads right into one of the questions that we just received. You talked about this returnship that you did and often doing work for little or no money. What changes do you think can be made to the policies for unpaid internships? Is it a government thing to enact laws? How do we motivate companies and organizations to really abolish this notion of unpaid internships?
Well, thinking back to the tangent I just went off on, if you will, I think we need to first see this as a problem in the space. in our space in particular, because there are other conversations about internships, unpaid, paid that happen in other sectors, but I think it's more of a problem in our sector for a variety of reasons. And if we see it as a problem, I think the funding community has a big role to play. What I would love to see, and if someone out there knows of something like this happening, feel free to reach out to me or connect to me. I will do whatever I can to get it in front of whoever I can or help however I can. But I think funders need to have a pool of funding to support young people who want to access careers in this space, who want to have internships, who want to grow in their skills and build their networks and be a part of the work that we're all doing.
Yeah.
And I think that that's probably the fastest solution. I don't want to get into a conversation necessarily around government policy because, uh, for one, we've all seen the way our country and the world is right now. But even beyond that, I think the world is moving, the world around us due to technology and other things is moving really fast. And policy is struggling to keep up with even the most massive issues that need to be addressed. I don't think the speed that's possible on the policy front is going to be helpful in solving challenges like this. But funders have immense clout and could do something about this issue tomorrow. And I would love to see that. It would open up a lot.
That's, you have a great point. One of the organizations that I feel so privileged to work with here at the Orr Group is Echoing Green. They are doing phenomenal things as social impact investors and really have a racial equity philanthropic fund that the Orr Group has been really, really proud to come along and help them with. They started off with this audacious goal of $50 million that they wanted to achieve in a year. And now we're closing in on 1 year and we've surpassed that significantly because people do see this as a really important thing to look at, not just what's going on right now, but preparing a bench, a future for those in the nonprofit world that come from the HBCUs, that come from the community colleges, Latinx and Indigenous institutions. And so there are funders out there, there are opportunities out there to engage in the work. So you bring up a really, really good point. We just have
and the concerns aren't disconnected. Oh, no. I was just going to say quickly, the concerns aren't disconnected. So this goes back to one of your earlier questions around what level of understanding do you need to have?
Yeah.
Well, if we were able to solve some problems around, unpaid internships, then we can go out into the communities that we serve and want to help and offer opportunities not only to send resources in, but to bring voices in to be a part of that process. And those, it becomes a kind of virtuous cycle where my mentee, maybe he needs a summer job and can get an internship at one of the organizations that supports the program that he's a part of. If we can get to that world, I think that we would all benefit. But apologies for interrupting. I think there were other questions.
Worries. That was a great point. That was a really good point. We have just a few more minutes for a couple of more questions, but one that has been burning my brain since I finished your book. We both live here in DC, and though I am not on your level as it comes to passion, if I walked into a karaoke bar, what song would I hear you singing?
So it shifted a bit over the years. My mom was an opera singer by training. She never did it formally, but she got a college scholarship. She didn't end up graduating. She had to take care of my grandmother, but she would not ever stop singing. So I grew up singing, and my outlet for that definitely is karaoke. And while the song has changed over the years, I've currently landed on Faithfully by Journey. I think that's going to be my song of the year. I don't know why, something about going through COVID, and then I recently did it. Being out and just belting out some Journey has been really cathartic and just an amazing experience. So I'd have to say Faithfully by Journey is tops on the list right now.
Love that. That is just, you're taking me back to the 80s. as if I needed any kind of urge to go there. That's what I listen to all the time. I know that people in the audience are trying to figure out how do we get in touch with you. I think if we direct people to democratizeventures.com, find you on LinkedIn. Yes. Twitter is Brandolon B, and on Instagram as well. But Brandolon, this has been fantastic to have this discussion with you. Any final thoughts that you wanted to make sure that you shared with our audience?
Just that if you are someone out there that you know is feeling that they have no hope, that there's no way out, the book is for that reason. I wrote it, and also I'm happy to talk. I've had folks reaching out to me on Twitter and through other channels who've said that they were in a similar place to my rock bottom, and that they felt some hope, and they had questions for me. Beyond anything else, I don't want anyone to go through what I've gone through if I can help. So feel free to connect and reach out, and know that challenging or having the conversations that we need to have, everyone has a seat at the table. And that's the most important thing. And so I want to be part of those conversations. So, whether it's to help someone else to find some inspiration, or to tell me your thoughts or join that conversation, feel free to reach out. I'm here.
Brandolon, I know your mom must be so proud because you've touched my mama's heart. And I want to thank you so much.
I hope so. Thank you.
For this. Thank you.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Good. And this has been so much fun. Again, anyone who would like to find this recording and share it with others, please go to the Orr Group social sites. It's been my pleasure speaking with Brandolon Barnett, who has just risen to the list of everyone's dinner party list now that outside is opened again. Just a great discussion that I've really enjoyed having with you, and a person that I'm so glad to now call friend.
Same.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.